Keep watching to see how I went from this to this to this. I had a lot of fun painting my cat Maple. This was a painting full of experiments. I'm using hot pressed paper, which means it's a really smooth texture compared to the cold pressed paper that has a rough texture on it, and so the paint is affected differently when you put it down. I also wasn't very strict on the paints I used. I usually use a pretty limited palette, but this time if I had a paint I wanted, I just threw it in, so I worked in some colors that I rarely used. This video is going to be a slower walk through my painting process. I think it'll be fun for you and you'll learn a couple things along the way. But compared to what I've been making, the pace is quite a bit slower. Let me know in the comments if you'd prefer more fast-paced or slow-paced content. Alright, let's jump in. As you saw, I pre-wet the paper so that way I could just go crazy with the background, make it really abstract so I could draw the viewer's attention in on the focal point, which is the cat's face. And then with the floor carpet, I do the same thing. I set in the lighter colors and I make it cooler towards the back edges so that way it kind of creates a vignette effect. Even though it looks kind of dark, it'll all dry lighter. A good rule of thumb is that the paint will dry about 30% lighter than what it starts with. In addition to that though, if you have wetter paper, it's going to dry a lot lighter and a lot paler as well. Now Maple has this really unique pattern and it's key that I capture that. By the time I start painting her, the paper is no longer wet and it's just damp. And because of that, the paint won't move around as much. This initial layer isn't about getting any detail in, instead it's about establishing the local color of the fur and getting some of the softer lights and darks in. Once I establish some of the darker areas later, the parts that look dark now will hopefully be shadows for white fur. You might notice that I'm leaving an area of white between the background and the fur. Maple is a very fluffy cat, and some of those ends of the fur catch the light in a unique way, and by not filling it all in, I'm trying to capture some of that delicate aspects of her fur. But yeah, because watercolor dries paler and lighter than what you initially start with, it gives you a chance with the initial layer to be bold with your colors and with what you're doing. So you see I covered the eye completely with color because I know it'll dry lighter, it won't be a big deal. I'll do a zoomed in picture of the eye later on. You'll see later that although I really love how this paw and arm turned out, I made it a little bit bigger than what it was meant to be, and I'll have to cut back on that by using the background later. But it'll look good hopefully, and we'll see what you think. Now, something that attracted me to the photo reference originally was the vivid red ball right in the middle that Maple was playing with. It's basically a clump of fur balled up together, and she loves to play with it occasionally. We have a bunch of different ones laid out everywhere. And in this painting, I'm wanting to make that an element of it. And so I'm going to put it in with this initial layer. I'm really just knocking it back a bit. It's not going to be as vivid. In fact, in this painting, I don't want it to be as vivid because I don't want everyone's eyes to be drawn to it. I want it to be drawn to Maple's face. I'm going to go with a second layer later to make the fluffiness come out a little bit more. Something I find challenging with painting Maple and really any animal is the fur and the detail that comes with the fur. I really struggle with trying to capture the different glimpses of light and the glimpses of dark, and also just the texture and layers of fur that come with it. But I think I found my solution to keep it loose but also organic and detailed. What I'm doing here is I'm just trying to create the illusion of detail. I'm not trying to paint every single tuft of fur because that's just not doable with what I want. It would kill me to do that time and time again for hours on end. I know some people love it, but for me that's just not what I like. So instead, I just want to make it look like there's a bunch of fur. So I'm letting the colors kind of blend together. I soften the edges to let it blend into the lower layer. And then toward the edges of the fur where I know there's going to be a dark and light contrast, I'll start to make more detail with the fur, kind of using my brush to swipe a tapered edge so that it looks like the fur is kind of flailing out and kind of sticking out in different points. The ears here were a lot of fun because I could use negative painting to give the illusion of the lighter fur. Her fur is really white out of those spots. But what ended up happening is the underlayer there was too dark, and so sometimes it didn't look quite white, but I think I still got the across that there's lighter fur right on top there. Maple's fur in particular is kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, there's a lot of flexibility with the colors I can use. I can use a range of lights and darks because her pattern is pretty unique. On the other hand, it's really challenging because you want to imitate that pretty well, and if you don't know what you're doing, it can get kind of tough. And for me, sometimes I had a struggle trying to make the lights of colors, the whites of her fur, and then the darks and the dark shadows of her fur. But I think I did an okay job, but let me know what you think. I used to really not enjoy animals. In fact, I tried to avoid it at all costs. It just wasn't what I was attracted to painting. What I liked was portraits of humans and then more comic booky styles. But what started to change my mind is how I could use negative painting and use really simple techniques to create the illusion of fur. And I really like how I did that on the right side of Maple's face here, where I was able to kind of create a pattern of a dark stroke plus a white stroke or lighter stroke plus a dark stroke, and I was able to create this pattern to make it look like light was catching the fur in a certain way, and it also allowed things to really develop to show an illusion of detail, like there's a bunch of fur there when there's really not. I think for me, what I have to do is find a balance between too much detail and not enough detail, and so I like to have places where I can incorporate some extra detail to catch people's eyes, but also some places where it's looser and flowy and kind of just allows the person to mellow in. And I really like the opportunity to do that with watercolor. It's just something that's unique to the medium that I can't do elsewhere, and it's a gift for me, honestly. I don't think I'd be able to do the stuff I like to do with watercolor in other mediums. Real quick, one of my tiny favorite details of this painting is the little tuft of fur that's at the very edge of her right ear. I think it just captured her perfectly. I kind of struggled to make the left side of Maple's face as dark as it really needed to be. I don't know why, but I ended up having to do an additional layer later, as you'll see. Just remember, whenever you're painting, you're gotta expect the watercolor to dry about 30% lighter or paler than what it was, and that can be kind of challenging if you're still getting used to the medium. Now, something that was kind of fun for this painting was that I had the opportunity to show how light is reflected and casted onto other figures. So with that bright red ball, it was actually casting a red hue amongst itself, even in the shadows on Maple's fur, and I wanted to really imitate that, especially to show that her fur is white there. So for example, with the mouth, the ball's shadow is being casted onto that spot, and so it's going to have a darker, redder hue to it, and so I wanted to make sure that that was shown. Now, it looks really dark here, it'll get lighter, I promise, but also even on the right side of her face where the cheek is, I wanted to bring in some of those red colors as well to show that this is a part of the environment, that there's things happening here that is really unique that you can't really just imagine sometimes. I was really happy with how it turned out. This paw, I think, was part of the composition that attracted me to the photo originally, but it's not a key element. It's something I definitely don't want people's eyes to be drawn to 100% of the time, so I'm going to be rendering out the detail as it gets closer to the face, but the further away and the closer to the actual paw you get, it's going to be less detail, it's going to be looser. So I don't render it a ton to where there's a bunch of darks and a bunch of lights and it's as detailed as the fur on her face, but there's going to be elements that I want it to make it enjoyable for the viewer to look at. And I think it was fun because you can actually see the little slits where the claws come out of, and that's something that's kind of cool, I guess. And I also really enjoyed using negative painting again to bring in the outline of the fur in some places too, but that'll be seen a little bit more later on. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to really spend some time on this upper shoulder part with the fur, and it's going to get pretty much mostly covered up later. And sometimes that happens. It's just is what it is, and it's part of the process. Now, this dark shadow between Maple and the floor is really key for this painting. It's what we call ambient occlusion, where the place where two surfaces meet, light can't get in, so it makes a dark space. And that shadow, it immediately grounds her into the scene. We can start to see this with the actual cat laying on the ground, and she's not just floating off in space. For this next shot, I really wanted to give you a closer look at how I painted the eye. I think it's one of the most fun parts, and it's really one of the key elements that I want to draw the viewer into. I wanted to make a mixture of light and dark greens to show it catching the light in different ways. I didn't use any green just straight out of the tube. I used a mixture of New Gamboge, French Ultramarine, Phthalo Blue, and then also a new paint that I got, which is Yellow Ochre. Something I really like about Yellow Ochre is that it really cancels out with French Ultramarine. It almost makes this really light, desaturated, dusty gray green, and it really mixes in with this really well. So here's my process. I go and color the entire eye, and then I go back and I lift some of the lighter parts of the eye out. After I do that, I let it dry fully, and then on a second layer, I go in and put the dark pupil in. A couple things to consider if you ever paint a cat eye or animal eye or a human eye. First, sometimes you can't just lift the paint out. Different paints react differently when touching the paper, and some will stain the paper more than others, so you kind of have to do some tests to make sure that that's okay. Second, the goal should be to try and create a smooth gradient look. Having some variety and some harsher edges is really good too, but you want to make this mystical look that has smooth transitions in it. Before we get back to the painting, I wanted to show you how this painting ended up a little warped, and maybe you've had that experience too with some of your paintings. Next week, I'm going to show you how I flatten my warped paintings and how it works consistently every single time. So go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss out on that. At this point, we're on the home stretch of this painting. What I'm basically going to be doing is just bringing in some more darks, a little bit more details, and then trying to frame everything to where it draws the viewer's attention right into the center. And that starts with this ball. I'm going to bring in some details, bring in the darks to add the depth to it, make it look like there's a clump of fur and clump of fluff that's not just uniform, but has detail and variety into it. It was tough, but I think those little details on the edges of the ball really made it pop and work with the painting. Like I said earlier, I felt Maple's left side of the face wasn't in as shadow as it should have been, so I came back through and added a little bit more detail and layers to bring out the fluffiness and the fur again, and also the darks. Now, even though Maple's face is pretty much done, I'm still going to be adding in some really key details soon, so stick around and pay attention to that. But before I could even get to that, I really felt like the floor was lacking. It's supposed to be a carpet floor, but it didn't really look like a carpet floor. Plus, it was just a really light blanket, and I didn't enjoy that. So what I'm trying to do now with the background and the foreground is draw the viewer in with darks, cooling things off, bringing in some small little details that makes it look like carpet without making it look too much like carpet and not distracting from Maple itself. I also felt like this was a key time to correct some of the mistakes I made with Maple's fur and her silhouette. For example, I wanted to make sure I showed some clear details with the fur and the fluff coming out of her cheeks, but also I realized that the anatomy with the shoulder and the paw and the arm was off, like I said before. So I come through, make some more color in here, and try and correct that before it was too late. Now, it's not perfect, and ideally this should have been done in the first layer, but overall, I think if you didn't know I made that mistake or error, you wouldn't notice it was a difference. This last section here is me just coming back through and adding some details that I missed or just weren't able to add at the very beginning of this painting. So I'm coming back doing the whiskers and then doing the glints of the eyes here. I used to be a pretty big watercolor purist to where I did not want to use anything other than watercolor in my paintings, so I would do my best to preserve the whites of the page if I could. But now I'm pretty comfortable using other things for small details because I'm not using it for the majority of the painting. So what I'm doing here, I'm using white gouache to bring back the whiskers and the glints of the eyes. Overall, I am really happy with how this painting turned out. I think I had a lot of fun. I learned a ton about how to paint cats, and it gets me really excited for what my painting may look like in a couple years. Hey, thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you had a lot of fun with it. And if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you left a like.